In this second video on competitive strategy, we will dive into the mechanics of competitive positioning to understand how a firm formed its competitive positioning and how a firm uses this positioning to pursue sustainable competitive advantage. The framework we will use to discuss competitive positioning is the value-cost framework, where we are focusing on the gap between the value the firm creates, or its economic contribution, minus the cost to produce that. And you'll note here that the blue range here, value minus price, represents the amount that the consumers keep, the buyer's surplus, where the red section is more the firm's profits or surplus, where it's a price minus cost. We will focus on V and C, though, more than price, because sometimes the firm may choose its price that will allow its consumers to capture more or less of this value. What's important to note here is that value is defined as the willingness to pay. It is the price a buyer is willing to pay in the absence of a competing product and in the context of other purchasing opportunities. It is determined by the buyer. Essentially, the value is what the product or service is worth to the buyer, and we'll use that definition to then understand competitive positioning. This slide briefly highlights the different drivers of value and cost, and you can see firms may use attributes such as the quality, the nature of delivery, the level of service, the type of technology, maybe the brand and reputation or the network externalities to drive up the value of the product or service to the customer. Meanwhile, on the cost side, firms will use things such as scale and scope economies or the learning curve or vertical integration to try and reduce its cost structure to achieve its cost advantage. If we now focus on a firm trying to pursue a value advantage or a differentiation advantage, here the firm must invest capital and money in resources and capabilities that will increase the value of its product or services and thus induce buyers to switch to your firm's offerings from a rival. This creates an advantage when the increased volume of customers switching due to a larger V minus P, a larger consumer surplus, is sufficient to cover the cost of those resources and capabilities necessary to create that value. And it's based on an assumption that buyers are value sensitive, in the sense that if we provide buyers with a greater V minus P, a greater consumer surplus, then they are likely to switch. Such a strategy of pursuing value through a differentiation advantage is more attractive when those investments will produce a higher return than any opportunities to reduce cost structure. In contrast, if I'm pursuing a cost advantage, I'm investing in resources and capabilities that will reduce my cost structure. In this way, I will increase the V minus C by either, one, reducing the cost, my cost, and the price to consumers without lowering margins. In other words, I reduce my cost by a certain amount and I immediately transfer that by reducing the price to the consumers. This increases the V minus P to consumers and then will thus drive up demand for my products. An alternative could be to reduce my cost through investments, but to not reduce my price. In this sense, I'm not going to gain any additional demand, but I'm going to earn a larger profit for myself because I've reduced my cost, but the price stays the same. Pursuing a cost advantage becomes less attractive when all firms in the industry have access to the same ability to reduce those cost structures. With this notion of value and cost advantage, we now want to apply it to the more common competitive strategy framework in the strategy literature. And this is Porter's generic strategies or Porter's business level strategies. Here, what you will see is on the left-hand side of this 2x2 are firms pursuing a cost advantage by reducing their cost structure, as we just noted. On the right-hand side are firms pursuing a differentiation strategy by focusing on increasing the value perceived to the buyer. These left and right-hand sides are similar to what we just discussed. The main thing we want to focus on here is the addition of the top versus bottom segment. At the top, you see a broad market scope. Thus, a broad cost leader or a broad differentiator focuses on a large segment or segments of the market, and so the mass market, and they're focusing on major sections or major customer segments. In contrast, a narrow market scope means A focused cost leader or a focused differentiator is focusing on a narrow segment of customers. And so a focused cost leader, for example, is focusing on serving a narrow set of customers, maybe by offering a single product or by focusing on a single region of the country and providing them with a cost leader or a cost advantage position through lower prices. In contrast, a focused differentiator is doing the same thing but providing more value to those customers, maybe offering them a highly unique product such as a Ferrari sports car or a Lamborghini. Meanwhile, at the broad level, a differentiator may focus on a larger portion of the market. So a cost leader here might be a company such as Walmart, while a differentiator might be a company such as BMW or maybe Toyota or Honda at a slightly lower level. You'll notice in the middle there's also the potential for a hybrid strategy where this is a firm that is combining a slight cost advantage over some of its rivals while a slight differentiation advantage over another set of rivals, and thus they have what's called a hybrid advantage where they're kind of riding in the middle of the competitive positioning grid that we discussed earlier in relation to defining what is strategy. It is worth also taking a minute to link now these concepts to that simple who, what, how definition of competitive strategy that we defined earlier in one of the earlier videos, an introduction to strategy. The who segment here, the who becomes which customer segments to serve, and this is going to define that focused versus broad dimension, the top versus bottom on the graph on the previous slide. The what need we satisfy then talks about the specific customer need or specific customer product or service. This may serve also to distinguish between narrow versus broad scope. And then finally, the how relates to the core competencies, the cost advantage versus the differentiation advantage that firms are using to pursue competitive advantage. There is one more type of competitive strategy that we must talk about, and Porter calls it stuck in the middle. And these are firms that cannot compete on value or on cost. They do not have a cost advantage and they do not have a differentiation advantage. As a result of lacking any advantage over their rivals, they tend to experience below average performance and they're very vulnerable to being put out of business when competition intensifies. And typically we get here because they either had a differentiation or a cost advantage that was not defensible, which we'll discuss in the next video. And as a result of competition or changes in the environment, their competitive position is no longer valuable to consumers and no longer unique, and as a result their advantage is gone. The bottom line here is firms that are stuck in the middle tend to lack a core competency and therefore lack one of the two types of advantages we've discussed.